Imagine being frozen in fear as you watch a child vanish beneath angry waves. Now imagine overcoming your deepest trauma to dive into those same waters that haunt your nightmares. This is what happened on a beach in California last summer, and the reason this story matters goes far beyond a single rescue. Most of us will never know what it's like to live with PTSD. The constant vigilance, the flashbacks that strike without warning, the way your own mind turns against you, transforming everyday situations into battlefields. For Marine veteran James Keller, water wasn't just water, it was a trigger that sent him back to a flooded Humvee in Afghanistan where he nearly drowned alongside two fellow soldiers. But when 7-year-old Mia Chen disappeared under the rough surf at Half Moon Bay, something more powerful than fear took over. Today, I'm taking you through this remarkable story of trauma, courage, and how our deepest wounds don't have to define our limits. The day began like any other for James Keller. At 34, the former Marine had developed a careful routine to manage his PTSD. Early morning runs along the beach, but never in the water. Never in the water. For 6 years since returning from his final tour in Afghanistan, James had avoided swimming. The nightmares were too real, too vivid. His therapist had suggested gradual exposure therapy, but James wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be. That particular Saturday in July, James had finished his run and was sitting on the sand, watching families enjoy the beach from a safe distance. The weather was perfect, sunny with a light breeze, but the surf was rough. Red flags dotted the beach, warning swimmers of dangerous conditions. Most people heeded the warnings, staying in the shallows. The Chen family had driven from San Francisco for a day trip. It was 7-year-old Mia's birthday, and she'd been begging her parents to take her to the beach. They were careful, staying in what appeared to be safe water only knee-deep. But anyone familiar with California beaches knows how deceptive they can be. A sudden drop-off, a powerful undertow, the ocean doesn't play by rules that feel intuitive to casual beachgoers. James noticed the family, mom, dad, and the little girl with bright water wings and an even brighter smile. He remembered thinking they looked happy, the kind of normal family scene that sometimes made his chest ache with longing for a life he wasn't sure he could ever have, not with the demons he carried. What happened next occurred in seconds. A large wave, bigger than the others, crashed onto the shore. When the water receded, Mia was gone. The water wings floated empty on the surface. The screams from Mia's mother cut through the beach noise like a knife. Her father plunged into the water, searching desperately, but he wasn't a strong swimmer. The lifeguard station was at the other end of the beach, at least a quarter-mile away. James would later say he doesn't remember making the decision to run toward the water. He just found himself moving, faster than he'd run in years. Every step toward the ocean sent panic through his system. The same panic he'd felt when his Humvee rolled into the irrigation canal in Helmand Province. The same panic he'd felt as water filled his lungs while he struggled to free his trapped teammates. But this time something was different. The fear was still there, overwhelming and familiar, but alongside it was something else, a clarity of purpose. A child was drowning, and no one else was close enough to help. When James hit the water, the flashback slammed into him with physical force. His mind flickered between Half Moon Bay and Afghanistan, between now and then, between the little girl he needed to save and the soldiers he couldn't. His therapist had a term for this: dual awareness, when trauma survivors simultaneously experience the past and present. For James, both realities were equally real in that moment. The water was cold, much colder than he expected, the undertow strong, but James had been an excellent swimmer before Afghanistan, before the trauma changed his relationship with water. The muscle memory was still there, and adrenaline did the rest. He spotted Mia about 30 yards out, her small body briefly visible as she struggled to surface. Then she disappeared again. James dove beneath the waves, forcing his eyes open against the salt sting. Visibility was poor, but he caught a glimpse of pink, the color of Mia's swimsuit, and swam toward it with everything he had. When his hand finally touched fabric, James felt a surge of relief so powerful it momentarily cut through the terror. He grabbed Mia and pulled her to his chest, then kicked hard for the surface. Breaking through, he gasped for air, making sure Mia's face was above water. She wasn't breathing. The swim back to shore was brutal. Each wave threatened to push them under. James's limbs felt like lead, and the flashbacks kept coming in waves as relentless as the surf. In his mind, he was simultaneously saving Mia and reliving the moment he'd been unable to save Lance Corporal Marcus Rivera, who'd been seated next to him in the Humvee. "Stay with me," James kept saying, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Mia or to himself. "Just stay with me." By the time he reached the shallows, other beachgoers had rushed to help. Someone took Mia from his arms, and James collapsed onto the sand, shaking violently. Through blurry vision, he watched as a woman, later identified as a nurse on vacation, performed CPR on Mia's tiny body. 1 minute passed, two. The crowd grew silent. Mia's parents huddled together, the mother's prayers audible in the stillness. Then a cough. Water spurted from Mia's mouth as she drew in a ragged breath. A collective exhale swept through the crowd as the little girl began to cry, the most beautiful sound anyone there had ever heard. James couldn't stop shaking. The aftermath of adrenaline, the cold water, the emotional weight of what had just happened, it all crashed over him. A paramedic draped a blanket around his shoulders, but the chill went deeper than skin. He was back there again, in the canal, watching Rivera slip away despite his efforts to pull him free. "You saved her," someone was saying. "You're a hero." But James didn't feel like a hero. Heroes don't freeze at the sight of water. Heroes don't wake up screaming 4 nights a week. Heroes aren't broken. Or so he thought. What happened that day at Half Moon Bay wasn't just about a rescue. It was about the complex reality of trauma and healing, how the path forward isn't always linear, and how sometimes our deepest wounds become the source of unexpected strength. In the days that followed, James would learn that Mia made a full recovery. No brain damage from the oxygen deprivation, no lasting physical effects. She remembered nothing of the incident, though she would forever carry the story of the soldier angel who saved her life. For James, the aftermath was more complicated. The rescue thrust him into a spotlight he never wanted. Local news picked up the story. PTSD-stricken veteran overcomes water trauma to save drowning child. Reporters wanted interviews. Strangers wanted to shake his hand. And James, who had spent years avoiding attention, avoiding anything that might trigger a flashback, suddenly found himself unable to hide. His therapist, Dr. Elena Vasquez, watched these developments with both concern and hope. "What happened on that beach was extraordinary," she would later explain in a panel discussion on trauma and heroism. But from a therapeutic perspective, it was also a massive exposure event. James was suddenly forced to confront his greatest fear in the most high-stakes situation imaginable. The question now was whether this forced confrontation would set back his recovery or potentially accelerate it. 2 weeks after the rescue, James met with the Chen family at a local coffee shop. It was his first public outing since the incident, and he'd almost canceled 3 times. But something compelled him to go, perhaps the same something that had propelled him into the water that day. Mia brought a hand-drawn card with a picture of a man swimming in blue crayon waves. Inside she'd written, "Thank you for being brave," in careful first-grade handwriting. Her parents could barely speak through their tears. "I don't know how to thank you," Mr. Chen said finally, his voice breaking. "There are no words." James stared at the card, at the simple crayon drawing that somehow captured the enormity of what had happened. "I wasn't brave," he said quietly. "I was terrified the entire time." Mrs. Chen reached across the table and took his hand. "That's what makes it brave," she said, "doing it anyway." It was a perspective James had never considered. In his mind, bravery meant fearlessness, the kind of steel-nerved calm he'd seen in fellow Marines who seemed untouched by the chaos around them. But maybe that wasn't it at all. Maybe bravery was feeling the fear and moving forward regardless. After meeting with the Chen family, James did something he hadn't done in years. He called several members of his old unit. Not the ones who had moved on effortlessly, but the ones who, like him, still struggled. The ones who would understand. "I went in the water," he told his former sergeant, Mike Delgado, who now worked as a contractor in Texas. "All the way in." The line was quiet for a moment. Mike knew about the Humvee incident. He knew about James's PTSD. He knew about the water. And Mike asked finally. "And I'm still here," James said, "still breathing." That call marked the beginning of a new phase in James's recovery, one where he began to reconnect not just with his trauma, but with the brotherhood that had witnessed it alongside him. They shared stories of their own struggles, their own triggers, their own moments of unexpected courage. Through these conversations, James learned something crucial. He wasn't alone in experiencing both strength and fragility. Every one of his fellow veterans carried their own complicated relationship with fear and bravery. Some couldn't handle loud noises. Others couldn't be in crowds. One couldn't drive after dark, yet each had moments where they'd pushed through these limitations when someone needed them. Dr. Vasquez had a framework for understanding this phenomenon. Trauma creates boundaries in our lives, she explained during one of James's sessions. Invisible walls that say, don't go here, it's not safe. But when something more important than our fear demands our attention, like a child in danger, those boundaries can temporarily dissolve. The key, she believed, was recognizing that these moments weren't anomalies. They were reminders of capacity that remained intact despite the trauma. Your brain proved something to itself that day, she told James. It proved that when needed, you can still access parts of yourself you thought were lost. 3 months after the rescue, James agreed to try a session of exposure therapy, something he'd resisted for years. It was a simple exercise. Stand ankle deep in the calm waters of a local pool for 5 minutes. Nothing more. The fear was still there as he approached the water's edge. His heart raced, his palms sweat. But now he had a reference point, a memory of having faced much worse and survived. I'm not asking you to save anyone today, Dr. Vasquez said gently as they stood beside the pool. Just to remember that water itself isn't your enemy. James nodded and took a step forward. Then another. The cool water lapped around his ankles, sending signals of alarm through his nervous system. But this time he had tools to respond. Breathing techniques, grounding exercises, the knowledge that feelings, even overwhelming ones, eventually pass. 5 minutes turned into 10. By the end of the session, James was sitting on the pool steps, water up to his waist, talking with Dr. Vasquez about his progress as if they were simply having coffee. It wasn't a miracle cure. James still had nightmares, still had days when the trauma felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. But something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with his own capabilities. 6 months after the rescue, Half Moon Bay held a small ceremony honoring James's actions. The mayor presented him with a Civilian Bravery Award. The local Coast Guard captain spoke about water safety and the importance of recognizing rip currents. Mia, now 8 years old, stood beside her parents, shy but smiling. When it was James's turn to speak, he hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strength, and talking about that day still brought up complicated emotions. But he had prepared something, not just for the audience but for himself. People keep calling me a hero, he began, voice slightly shaky. But that day on the beach I wasn't thinking about being heroic. I was terrified. The water, he paused, took a breath. The water has been my greatest fear since Afghanistan, since I lost friends there. A hush fell over the small crowd. What I learned that day wasn't about bravery in the way most people think of it. It was about something else. Something about how we're all capable of more than we believe, especially when someone else's need is greater than our fear. He looked at Mia, then at his therapist who stood at the back of the room. I'm still working on my relationship with water, with fear. This isn't a story that ends with "and then I was cured." But it's a story about possibilities, about how our worst experiences don't have to define our limits. James's story spread beyond Half Moon Bay, reaching other veterans struggling with PTSD. He began receiving messages from former service members who saw themselves in his experience, not just the trauma, but the moment of breakthrough, of connection, of purpose beyond pain. Encouraged by Dr. Vasquez, James started speaking at small veterans groups about his experience. Not as someone who had overcome PTSD, he was careful never to present himself that way, but as someone learning to live alongside it without letting it dictate the boundaries of his life. The water is still hard, he would tell them, but now I know it's not impossible. A year after the rescue, James returned to Half Moon Bay. It wasn't planned as a meaningful anniversary visit. He'd simply been invited to a barbecue by a new friend from his veterans support group who happened to live nearby. But as the gathering wound down, James found himself drawn to the shore. The beach was quieter than it had been that July day. A few families played in the sand. A couple walked hand in hand along the water's edge. The waves were gentle, almost apologetic. James walked to the spot where he remembered sitting before everything changed. He gazed out at the water, feeling the familiar anxiety rise in his chest, but now it was accompanied by something else, a sense of connection, of meaning found in the midst of fear. He didn't go swimming that day. That wasn't the point. Recovery wasn't about erasing fear or pretending trauma didn't exist. It was about expanding what was possible despite it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, James pulled out his phone and opened a text message from Mia's mother. She sent them every few months, updates on Mia, photos of her swimming lessons, now with a very attentive instructor, grateful reminders of the gift James had given their family. The latest message included a picture of Mia holding up a school assignment, "My hero," written at the top in bold letters. Beneath it was an essay about James, written in the unpolished but heartfelt prose of a second grader. "My hero was scared of water, but he saved me anyway," one line read. "That's what makes him special." James smiled at the simple wisdom, out of the mouths of babes, as they say. As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, he noticed a sign that hadn't been there before. "In case of emergency, call 911. Remember, rip currents are strongest at the surface. If caught, swim parallel to shore." Perhaps that was the greater lesson in all of this. Not just about physical rip currents, but the emotional ones too. Sometimes the way through isn't fighting directly against the force pulling you under. Sometimes it's finding another path, one that respects the power of what you're facing while refusing to be dragged down by it. For James Keller, the path forward would never be perfectly straight or entirely free of obstacles. There would still be nightmares, still be therapy sessions, still be days when the water seemed too much to face. But there would also be this, the knowledge that within him existed both vulnerability and strength, fear and courage, trauma and healing, not as opposing forces, but as parts of the same complex human experience. And there would be Mia growing up, learning, living a life that might otherwise have been cut short. A living reminder that our deepest wounds don't have to be the end of our story. Sometimes, they're just the beginning of a different one. If you found this story moving, you're going to want to see our next video about a firefighter who overcame his fear of heights to save an entire family from a burning apartment building. Click now to hear his incredible journey.